Good afternoon. I'm going to slightly change tack, really. Knowledge. I mean, this morning I thought I had knowledge. I thought I had an understanding. I was busy profiling. So I thought all psychologists stand behind the lectern, all pilots stand out in front. However, this afternoon I've had to revise my view, and obviously lunch means everyone has to have something to lean on, so we all stand behind the lectern. So really what everyone here this morning, as far as I can see, is looking at it from the self-reporting view of mental health. My role in all this is selection. When people come to me, I'm asked to evaluate them for their skills, I'm not asked to evaluate them for behaviour, and increasingly now, I'm being asked to evaluate them for mental health. So people come to me wanting a job or promotion, and I have to look at them in that big picture. And that sort of changes things from my perspective. I am an aviation psychologist, and I'm commercial. So therefore, I should be going, what do you do? This is great. However, I'm not. I have to say, I'm sitting here today very concerned about what the industry is asking me to do, some of the things that I'm seeing out there from this perspective, this side of the fence. And I would just like to share some of that with you, because a lot of what I was going to talk about has been covered, so I don't need to reinvent that. If I can figure out. So, you know, when we talk about knowledge, what knowledge? We've already talked about who's going to collect this data, who's going to do it, and to do what. So from the selection point of view, if somebody's presenting to me, what do I do with that information? How do I report it? And what happens to that individual? Because they're not actually in the system yet, or they're in the system, but going forward for promotions. So, how do we spot and interpret behaviours? And when they come to me for a four-hour selection process, let's say, what do people want me to report? What are they expecting of me as somebody who is allowing people into their organisations? And that age-old adage, what is normal? How do we define normal? And within the pilot population, in a sense, what is normal? And then how do we give feedback to those individuals? So quick overview, this isn't by any means a presentation of what we do, but the way we go about our business, and there's plenty of tools and ways of doing it, is we profile the organisation, we have data for pilot populations and other populations, we don't just do aviation. And then what we try and do is triangulate. So depending on what our customers and clients want, we try and look at that individual as many different ways as we possibly can. So we have our own tools. We have Advanced Personality Questionnaire, which is much more behavioural based. It's not, I don't care personally whether you're introvert or extrovert, that doesn't bother me. What I am interested as a sports psychologist and performance psychologist is how pressure affects you, how you behave when you're out of your comfort zone, and what coping strategies you have going forward. So, so what we try and do, depending on the client's budget, is issue self-reporting aspects. We do aptitude tests, and we also do Skype interviews. And that actually is becoming, we do face-to-face interviews, we do all sorts of other things, but the Skype interview is becoming quite an interesting tool in the toolbox, because people forget where they are, because we aren't the airline, and because they're at home, we're starting to see quite a lot of behaviours. So I have interviews, I don't know if I'm sure other people here have had the same thing, where people are interviewing for their command upgrade and are drunk whilst I'm talking to them. I mean, they are drinking whilst I'm interviewing them for their command upgrade. They just seem to forget where the boundaries are, because I don't have an airline logo on me and they don't know who I am, but Skype seems to give them that distance. As I said, they're interviewing from their couch or their bedroom or wherever. So, knowledge, finding the balance. Why do we need knowledge about our individuals? We need knowledge, as has been well covered today, for safety reasons and also for the sector's reputation. The general public to be assured that the industry is doing its best to protect them and themselves. However, on my side of the fence, when I'm asked to get engaged by clients, I'm up against this side which is the operational day-to-day potential conflicts of interest with maintaining that. So if somebody sends me somebody for assessment, and we get people as well for behavioural changes, so they're people sending not just people for promotion or instructor sideline, they send them to us because they've noticed behavioural change. Now that in itself is quite an interesting one, because you're sending someone for an assessment who has behavioural changes, who is now feeling really under pressure, and what the consequences of that might be. So we do see some incredibly odd behaviours, probably because of the situation they're being put in, rather than the fact that they're actually going through anything particular or long-term mental health issues. Operational conflicts. If we send somebody back and that person has indicated that there is some abnormal traits, abnormal behaviours, what does that airline do with them? And as a case history, we were sent an individual who is he was a refugee coming from a war zone, converted his licence, moved his family, settled well. Things were going wrong for him. He had real problems, and he was getting depression, whether it's depression or not. I always worry about people coming through sectional assessment processes about diagnosis. I don't do diagnostics or diagnosis of people's issues. I just know whether there are behavioural changes and then recommend they go to the airline's psychiatrist, psychotherapist or whatever. So, this person really had problems. He was nearly in tears, he couldn't speak, he couldn't cope with the assessment at all. So we sent him away and we suggested that somebody did talk to him. After 2 weeks, he was then represented to us for assessment again. This time he was even worse. He couldn't even remember that he had been with us 2 weeks before. He was trying to pretend he hadn't been with us. So again, the report went back. This person really needs help. We recommend he comes off the line and talks to someone. It was during a real shortage. It was right in the peak period. They needed pilots on the line. They had quite a few people more sick. They had pilot shortages. They sent him to the psychologist. After 30 minutes with the psychologist, the report came back ticking like a clock. This person had a lot more serious problems than that. And then 30 minutes with anybody, he needed more than that. But they needed him back on the line. So these are some of the operational conflicts that we see on a regular basis. The other thing we have when people come to us is if somebody's coming for a job, they're not in the industry, if these are youngsters just out of training, just ramped up a nice £100,000 training bill, and they come to me or to the process, and we discover that they may have some issues on the spectrum. What are legal or moral responsibilities to those individuals? I'm not suggesting I have the answers, but it is opening up for me quite a challenge. People have already, the protectionism side has been well covered today. I don't need to go into that, I don't think. By protectionism I mean when people are fine. And I have an anachronism for fine, which I'm probably not for this company. So what are reportable behaviours? The risk of diagnosis when you're coming through an assessment for a job. Very uncomfortable with that, but that's what I'm being asked to do. Depression, okay? That's obviously one that we need to look at, but I don't know this person, I don't see him on a regular basis. Is it my job to, I can diagnose that he has behaviours that might indicate that. So if we start looking down the DSM-5, anorexia, is that a problem that needs reporting or not? From the world I come from a while ago, which is sport, we see a lot of anorexia. It doesn't stop people, rugby players, people you would not expect have anorexia. Do we now need to report that? Now the next one's an interesting one, the autism spectrum. From this very lecture, and I've reported, and I know other psychologists have, that more and more youngsters are showing signs of increased narcissism. And the Asperger's, if you want to label people, how far along that spectrum, if you notice things, is acceptable or when does it need to be reported. Again, I don't know if it's an issue, I don't know if it's a problem, should I be getting involved in it, but I am being asked by clients to do that. Phobias, obsessions. I had another in the week of the MH370, I was in the Middle East and I was interviewing quite a few candidates, and several of them were first officers from Air Malaysia. Two of them in particular presented to me and wanted, obviously, because they'd flown with this captain, and had a lot of pictures of this captain on his phone. And they would be showing them, and clearly this captain, they felt he was a wonderful mentor. He had been, he had a simulator at home, and he'd been taking them, and, well, it seemed a bit odd, it seemed a bit obsessive. Now, was that because I came to that view because of what had happened to MH370, or if that hadn't happened that week, would I have just disregarded it and said, here's a very young, very enthusiastic first officer who has found himself a mentor, who is bringing him along. So, starting to see things that aren't there or are there, depending on what's happened. And I'm worried that with the German wings aspect, we start to see things that before would have been fine. The other thing we see, when we see behaviours, how much of that is immaturity in the youngster? When they're going to go through a training programme, how much of that will be trained out? You see sulky, defensive or passive-aggressive behaviours, the airline may not want them, and certainly when we profile organisations, and if we're profiling for the Middle East or for Asia, we're looking for mentally robust and tough individuals, far more so than perhaps the UK market. And there are clear differences between the profiles. But there are things that if somebody's got low locus control and coping strategies, should they be coming into the aviation? I know I'm raising a lot of questions here, but we have to make those judgment calls. We're asked to be sitting there and to say, this person is suitable for your organisation. And some organisations, as we've heard today, are really supportive and will mentor those people through, and we know some organisations won't. And I suppose our job is to make sure we place the right pilots into the right airlines to make sure that happens. The one thing we do see as we go around, because we work with a lot of different airlines, is between airlines we see a lot of toleration of different behaviours. One person's rejection is another person's good to go. But we also see within an airline's own assessment department, we see lots of different levels of assessment of what's suitable and what's not suitable. So even within an airline, there is no consistency of assessment and selection, and people and different levels of background, so people don't really know what they're looking for. So it'd be lovely to see some form of guideline, some form of training to kind of standardise that. I've really touched on this, but if anyone can give me guidance around in the break about what we should be doing, how we feed back to youngsters who are presenting just in an immature way. And I know there's lots of training out there for interview training. Sometimes for our process anyway, which is behavioural based, if they've done a questionnaire and they've been interviewed and they've gone through some form of physical assessment, what we're looking for is that consistency between all phases, that at some point they're not faking good or they're not giving somebody else's interview. So we're looking for that confidence in their own behaviour and that willingness to take feedback. Because more and more what we're also being asked to do is provide developmental, just the sort of upside of this, is developmental side of what we do. So following up on that is for the reporting and feedback, it's already been touched on, what are my cut-off scores? Culturally, do I need to adjust that? I would suggest we do. We use Hofstede. For airline, we have different scores, different cut-off scores, different tolerances. How do I phrase the report? What phraseology should we be using? The justification for what we found, if we're rejecting or accepting somebody, because we have to take responsibility for letting that person come into the industry or go from the right-hand seat to the left-hand seat. If we have, so it's an employee and that person we have discovered may have a few issues that could benefit them from working on. When does that cure? How is that person then decided that they're ready to go forward? What is that point when we say, right, you've now completed that process, you've done your development, and now you're ready to go? And above everything else, whatever we do, and whatever the airline does, needs to withstand legal challenge. It has to be justified. Just quickly. Two people, almost identical backgrounds. This guy, very high achiever. Very self-aware and thoughtful. Really, really good candidate. Performed exceptionally well. Some of the best with physical and the cognitive behaviours were really good. Some of the best we've seen. No issues. He did raise he'd had a bit of an argument with his father about doing aviation, but he said it had been rectified. Whilst he was in training, his father died. So in his culture, he became the head of the family. And there was guilt about doing the aviation job and being away when his father died. On the day that he was accepted into his first airline job, they had a party. He quietly went upstairs and hung himself. Now this guy is a high achiever, would never have hurt anyone else, I don't believe. He was harmful to himself, and this has already been raised. Whether this is people who harm through disruption or taking others with them. So should he have been rejected, should he have not been given the opportunity to have a job because of the pressures that he puts himself under? And more and more, we are hearing, in fact, it was on this morning about SATs, on general education. Pressures of youngsters, the high achievers are often the ones that do commit suicide. This individual, high achieving family, same thing. He did show some reds and ambers on some of the hazardous attitudes, abnormal behaviours, stability, things like that. That was on his personality questionnaire. In interview, he was interviewed not by retraining people to do our interview process, and he interviewed incredibly well. He was borderline. He was accepted into training, into the job rather, as a young post officer, and he has attempted suicide. Turns out he's attempted suicide twice previously and has been trying again. Very disruptive, attention-seeking, and using it to sort of isolate himself, as I said, attention-seeking. Now that person, for me, is much more disruptive to his fellow co-workers, and we said, probably not. The client said, we will, and the questionnaire results actually gave a more accurate insight into his potential personality, but good practice says you should not rely on the questionnaire alone. You should rely on more than the interview and other processes. Once you've identified a risk, you have to do something about it, and that, I know, does cause some airlines problems, because the finances, the time, the personnel to put the programs that we've heard today, not all airlines can support that. So just in summary, and again I think this is reflecting what we heard earlier this morning. Define the language of reporting. What are the cut-off scores? What tools are we going to use? If we're going to be asked to sit in judgment on people coming in to a job not from knowing them, not from their colleague, not from people who are very much aware of how these people behave or behaving on the job, we need very clear guidelines. We need to remove the potential for conflict of interest. And also now, more and more, in reflection of what I've heard today, airlines are saying to me, right, Nikki, when you do this, could you then give us some development plans for these individuals, and we will put them on a development process. So we produce reports, in a true sports psychology way, or performance psychology, we list the things, their goals, the things that they would do well to improve on, and everybody gets one of those, so nobody's stigmatised in any way. So everybody gets a development and improvement plan. Just some get more than others. That goes forward, and from there, the airlines have got something that they can work with and then can measure against. Now that for me is very encouraging, and we really like to work that way. And the other thing that these kinds of things really are encouraging is sharing knowledge and techniques, because I know certainly in my world, in the commercial side, and psychology, sometimes knowledge can be, knowledge is power, I suppose, a little bit. So we try and not tell everybody everything. It's great to share knowledge.